Well, hello and welcome to our fourth webinar, Power Grab, Freedom in Hungary and COVID-19. Extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. In Hungary, Prime Minister Victor Orban now has the power to rule by decree, and anyone who spreads false rumours can face jail time of up to 5 years. The new law has caused an outcry from civil liberties advocates who say it may have a lasting impact. Elsewhere, governments around the world are also introducing steps that would, in normal times, provoke a public outcry. So welcome once again to this webinar, hosted by us, Political Tours, and our sister company, Beyond the Headlines. Over the next hour, we'll be looking at one of the most crucial debates of our time. Just how far should governments be allowed to curb our civil liberties in an attempt to control the virus? And what impact is this likely to have in the long run? Joining us now, we have three leading speakers to discuss the case of Hungary and the implications for what is, after all, the world's largest political and economic bloc, the European Union. In Budapest, we have Nick Thorpe.
Hello.
And then we also have, joining us in a bit, Gerald Knaus. And then also in Budapest, Boris Kálnoky. Nick is the BBC Central Europe correspondent, and he'll outline Viktor Orban's latest steps and describes how Hungary's nationalist Fidesz party is hoping to reshape the EU in its own image. Gerald Knaus is the founder of the European Stability Initiative, one of the most influential think tanks in the European Union at the moment. The ESI says the EU needs to find a way to stop countries like Hungary undermining democracy. Boris Kálnoky is the Budapest-based correspondent for the German newspaper Die Welt, who has covered Central and Southeastern Europe since the 1980s. He believes the criticisms made of Hungary and other states are overblown. It's time for the preaching from Brussels and elsewhere to stop. Well, I think the first thing to do, Nick, is to turn to you and really ask you what has been happening in Hungary, both in terms of the recent laws that have been adopted by the Hungarian parliament, as well as the criticism generally is what's been seen as a steady erosion of human rights and democracy in the country over the past few years. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Nicholas. I think I'll call you Nicholas so that no one's confused about the two Nicks present here. I think the best way to understand the new powers voted by Parliament to the Fidesz government, to Viktor Orban personally, is to put them in a wider perspective of the last 10 years, at this concentration of powers in his hands, basically in his government's hands. Let's have a look, first of all, at a few slides which illustrate that. Here on the first, the headline in the Financial Times from, I think, the 30th of March, Orban handed power to rule by decree in Hungary. He was handed it, he didn't seize the power. He has a 2/3 majority in the Hungarian parliament of his own party, and it was voted very smoothly by his own party. So those are the powers which I'll go into in a moment, that he was voted by Parliament for an indefinite period. Second slide, if we could look at that, from The Economist, a few days later, I think April the 2nd, how Hungary's leader Viktor Orban gets away with it, not got away with it, but gets away with it. So basically a look in this editorial in The Economist at how Mr. Orban, a very skilled political operator, a very experienced, more than 30 years of day-to-day, the bruising battle of politics, that he's been involved in, a leading player in Hungary all of that time and increasingly in Europe, how he basically functions and how even his membership of the biggest political group in the European Parliament, the European People's Party, how even that doesn't restrain him, how he manages to play off the different factions within that, to stay within that EPP and remain a significant European statesman. Coming on to the next slide, please. Here we are, some cartoonist views, not such a recent one. I think this is from 2018, July 2018. And in the air balloon there, you see Viktor Orban and Mr. Kaczynski from Poland flying off away into the blue yonder and ditching as they fly, in order to help them fly higher, three bags of sand. One of them, I think, has the words democracy on, the other free expression, the other, I think, the free media. So basically ditching the checks and balances which most democracies take for granted in order to help them fly higher. If we could go on to the next slide. Here, this is from July 2017, I think. The slogan there, the headline on the slide in Hungarian means "They are together breaking down the border fence." And there in the very middle is George Soros, of course, the Hungarian-born financier who has become a major bogeyman for Viktor Orban and his government. Mr. Soros, in this case, in this national consultation, these accusations against Mr. Soros are put together with different opposition leaders from Hungary, all of them accused of taking down the Hungarian fence, which was actually really specifically not true. None of those people had actually proposed the dismantling of the fence. Mr. Soros, though, very much an attack, under attack here as a bogeyman. This was just a few months, half a year before the April 2018 general election, which Mr. Orban, of course, won handsomely once again with by vilifying his opponents, among other things, apart from the other reasons of his genuine popularity in the country. Interestingly, in this picture, over on the right in the stripy shirt is Gergely Karácsony. Since then, just in October last year, he was elected in the local elections as mayor of Budapest and has become a humble but a significant alternative center of power in the land. I'll talk more about him later. Next slide, please. Here we have also from 2017, July, from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, this headline, George Soros compares the Hungarian government campaign against him to Nazi propaganda. Mr. Soros, obviously of Jewish background, referring to this campaign of vilification against him. The poster you can just about see beneath the headline there these were giant billboards plastered all over Hungary, which says, "Don't let Soros have the last laugh." And some people compared that to posters which went up of grinning Jewish people in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. Next slide, please. And here, a more recent headline, very recent one. Donald Tusk wants to expel Fidesz from the European People's Party until the end of 2020. The Polish president of the European People's Party, they're saying that they don't want the significant number of parties, though perhaps not a majority yet, we don't know, within the European People's Party, wanting on a European level to withdraw that platform which Fidesz and which Viktor Orban personally have been using very effectively until now. I think there's one more slide. And here we have the Hungarian parliament has been quarantined indefinitely. Mr. Orban there with the medals and his name above the medals there, the tricolor flag of Hungary, wearing, interestingly, his rubber gloves for the COVID-19 epidemic and a face mask, of course. This is possibly a reference also to statements made by opposition members of Parliament during the final debate on the March 30 extraordinary powers, just before Parliament, obviously with the against the votes of the opposition, very small opposition, voting for those extra powers, and one opposition deputy during that debate saying that basically by doing this you have put not just the Parliament but Hungarian democracy into quarantine.
So, Nick, thank you very much for the overview there. We're going to get into the criticisms of Hungary overall. This hasn't just started now. This is something that has been levelled at Hungary over a period of almost a decade, in which the government has concentrated powers, given itself greater powers, weakened the constitution, weakened the courts, and undermined the media. I mean, those are just some of the accusations levelled at it. But can you just talk specifically about the recent laws introduced in March and in April? What are these emergency measures? Why do they matter?
Sure. Well, basically what Hungary did, what this government did, was already on March the 11th, it declared a state of danger uses the word danger rather than emergency. And basically what happened on March the 30th was that state of danger either needed to end or it needed to be extended. What the Fidesz government chose to do was not just to extend it in time from the original 15 days, but to extend it indefinitely and to extend it also the kind of powers which the government was given by Parliament in this vote. I'll just quote, make a couple of quotes from the law just to give a sense of the kind of powers we're talking about here. Paragraph 1, the government may suspend the enforcement of certain laws, depart from statutory regulations, and implement additional extraordinary measures by decree. Paragraph 2, the government may exercise the competence granted in paragraph 1 to the extent necessary and in proportion to the desired objective for the purpose of preventing, managing, and eliminating the human epidemic. Finally, the government may do this until the end of the emergency. To understand this, basically, one does need to put it in the context, as you say, of the past decade of measures by the government. Effectively, so it now has the right to rule by decree, putting this into everyday language, even in the absence of Parliament, but still under the monitoring of the Constitutional Court. It's very important to understand that Mr. Orban, his Fidesz party, enjoys a 2/3 majority, a constitutional majority in the Hungarian parliament. It passed a constitution in 2011, a single party constitution. We won't go into the debate about how it came to that, but effectively it was a Fidesz constitution without the agreement of other parties. And interestingly, in that constitution, which was rather a rushed job at the time, this allows the possibility, really, there's a lack of safeguards in the constitution. So under Hungarian law, what Mr. Orban has done with this seems to be constitutionally fine. Some people challenge that, but basically he's taking the powers that he does have under the Hungarian constitution to invest in himself for an indefinite period of time. Effectively, what his critics say is a carte blanche, a blank check. The Hungarian Helsinki Committee, for example, says that highlights in particular the fact there's no sunset clause, that the government itself will decide how long its powers stay. And the Constitutional Court as such, it sounds like a proper check or balance in any democracy, but one has to understand that since 2011, some of the powers of the Constitutional Court have been stripped away by law in accordance with the Constitution. And in fact, the Constitutional Court, which now has 15 members, is packed effectively with Fidesz people. So it's not a body which is ever going to challenge the fundamentals of the laws which the Hungarian parliament, sorry, the Hungarian government, the Hungarian decree, the Hungarian government is passing. So a serious lack of constitutional checks.
Well, in a moment, we'll come to Boris Kálnoky, who will defend some of the government's measures. But what I'd like to do, first of all, is turn to Gerald from the European Stability Initiative. You've been particularly critical of these developments. You've also just suggested that the EU has been particularly weak at dealing with them and sanctioning Hungary in any way. And most recently, suggesting that the recent Corona aid package has handed far more funds to Hungary than to Italy, when Hungary has so far escaped the worst of the virus. Now, we've had a bit of problems speaking with Gerald, but we're going to be able to speak to him now. And he's talking now about the amount of money that has been given to Hungary over the past few years or so, with very, very well, with no strings attached. Here's Gerald talking about some of that money being handed over to Hungary.
Yeah, this is just money that, as the Hungarians pointed out immediately, they were always going to get. But that is precisely the problem. What we are seeing here, let me just remind you, and go back to February 2013, when the European Union made a decision on its 7-year budget, and when Hungary was promised 25 billion euros, which is 17% of its GDP. Over 7 years, And Viktor Orban used a very memorable image at the time that this was, I think it was 7 train wagons full of 20,000 foreign bills. I mean, he basically said, listen, this is a bonanza, a huge amount of money we're getting from the EU. 7 years ago, this year it will amount to almost 4% of Hungary's GDP. 4%. This was announced while Italy, from this 37 billion euros, will get 0.1%. And our point was very simple. And the Commission actually admitted it in a press conference when they were asked about whether this makes sense in response to the corona crisis. And it said, well, it would have been very hard to change. No, it would have been very hard to change because the system the EU has at the moment is it makes long-term allocations to countries irrespective of what happens in those countries in the next 7 years. It's like a cash machine. Money just flows. So if it tries to use this money to defend some, and I'm talking about very few core principles, like keeping democracy alive, keeping parliaments alive, keeping media freedom, respecting the rule of law, and especially keeping a system alive where prosecutors and courts across the EU are able to enforce the rule of law, including EU rules adopted. Well, this system is under vital threat. And it's under threat at the same time in Poland and Hungary. And the two are connected because Viktor Orban has been the one who said most openly, whatever the Poles do, I will back them up. So the Article 7 procedure, which the EU has to defend the rule of law, which has been, of course, opened against Hungary and Poland, is a dead letter because one veto is enough. So it could never actually go to the final sanction. What Poland has been doing, what Viktor Orban has been backing so loudly, is undermining any independence of its courts. It has been taken to the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice has ruled in very strong language that the rule of law needs to be defended and courts independent in every single member state. It has recently ruled that a new chamber created, a disciplinary chamber used to discipline judges in the Supreme Court, has to stop working while it is looking at the whole disciplinary system. And the Polish government, as we speak, has been saying, well, we don't know if we will actually implement this ruling from the European Court of Justice. So what we are facing is a challenge from Poland, from Hungary in a concerted way to the whole idea that the EU has the legitimacy and the right to look into and defend the foundational values in Article 2 of its treaty. The EU shouldn't have this right, is the message, the argument, and are the actions in Poland and Hungary. Now, second point, so this was happening. Hungary is getting an enormous amount of money from the EU. 4% of GDP is crucial for Viktor Orban and has been crucial for the last few years to sustain the sense that this is an incredibly successful economic policy that he's been carrying out. Second point, while the EU has been funding Hungary, and there are very strong good arguments for cohesion funding in terms of equity, the common market, but while the EU has done this, Viktor Orban keeps attacking it, saying that he is not getting any help. If you look at the website of the Hungarian government, if you look at the media, the message from Hungary is, well, listen, this money we just keep getting is irrelevant because this was promised to us years ago. Now we're not getting any help from the EU, and you see on the website one celebration after the other of Uzbekistan donating 150,000 masks. The same week, Hungary is sending 100,000 masks to Northern Macedonia. I mean, there's this mask diplomacy to cement friends and create a sense of support and solidarity. But it's solidarity from China, from Uzbekistan, from Turkey. It's never the EU. In fact, Orban has been attacking the EU with a very strong story, which is exactly the same story you find with the AfD in Germany, that the EU is an empire. It is trying, in the tradition of the Soviets or Habsburgs, to destroy nation states. And these are all quotes, and we've written about this a long time. The EU is in line of a global conspiracy masterminded by George Soros, that, of course, Mr. Juncker, the president of the Commission, was on this conspiracy, that there were posters all over Hungary saying that Juncker and Soros together are trying to undermine and destroy the Hungarian nation state. That Brussels is a weak flower eaten by worm. That's a quote by Viktor Orban. I mean, this is not one or two speeches. This has been the consistent rhetoric in the last few years. So if this is the rhetoric that the enemies of Europe, I mean, of the European construction as it exists today, are using around Europe, coming from the government that is, in per capita terms, the second biggest beneficiary of aid in the last 7 years, we have a political problem. Now, that's the second part of what happened. The third part is that the EU is discussing the future of solidarity. I mean, there will be a need for more European solidarity to help countries that are hard hit and don't have the means. And what we have been saying is this debate cannot be a purely macroeconomic one. If we want to keep the EU together, then this money must be tied. And we're not talking about telling governments what they can decide. We are telling governments, we're talking about defending the core values, the rule of law, the idea of independent courts, of freedom of the media, of parliaments that can act, core values in Article 2 of the European treaties, without which the EU as a legal space cannot operate. I mean, if our leaders, if European leaders come to Brussels and discuss nights and nights on regulations and legislation, and then countries go home, governments go home and either silence the media looking into what is happening, silence or weaken the opposition fatally so it can't play its roles, undermine the independence of courts, stop prosecutors investigating even serious corruption allegations, then this idea of jointly sharing sovereignty loses all credibility. Because then in the end, why are we making these laws if the rule of law is not guaranteed? So, to conclude, as we think about more solidarity, as we are discussing recovery funds, money that should be raised from some countries in the EU to be spent in others to help them cope with the crisis in a way that preserves European cohesion, we must take the lesson from the last 7 years of structural funds, that countries that received the most EU money end up today being the most aggressive forces attacking the very foundations of the EU and use this money to cement autocratic rule. Now, if we don't want this to be repeated, if we want solidarity to strengthen and not undermine the European project, then it needs to be tied to some very clear conditions. And we recommend, one, obviously, that any government that gets funding needs to comply with the core rule of law values. There is a proposal by the Commission how to assess this in the Council. And the second point should be that any government needs to implement every European Court of Justice decision related to Article 2. Now, Hungary will say that it has no problem with this. Well, if the current decree is taken to the European Court of Justice, that would be a test. Poland would have a problem.
Gerald,
because
let me just stop you there. I think there's some people who won't be so familiar with the European Union structures, so some of this is a bit complex. But I think the most fundamental.
I've been talking to too many Europeans recently.
Yeah. The counts the.
Let me put it like this, very simply. The European Union has a very, if I explain it to a 15-year-old, it's based on one idea, that it's not an empire. We have no soldiers or troops or police to enforce any EU law in member states, fortunately. So countries bind themselves voluntarily to this idea that they make joint laws and then they implement them. It's not like the Habsburg Empire, which sent soldiers to Budapest, or the Soviets. It's voluntary compliance with the rule of law. Now, if countries then don't respect this by undermining the basis, the question is, what holds the EU together?
Right. The other point I was going to make is that if you're going to sanction, there are some ways that you could try and sanction Hungary, and that's through the governments when they come together in Brussels, and that's called the European Council, when the heads of state or the ministers all meet together there in Brussels. But those decisions are not, by and large, has to be an absolute majority on most issues. So it'd be very, very difficult for Hungary to be sanctioned in that way. But let's not get bogged down too much in the sort of minutiae of some of those mechanisms. But Boris, can I come to you and ask just specifically about the emergency powers, the Act, which has, funnily enough, the same name, the Enabling Act, as used by the Nazis in 1933. There's a sort of an unfortunate parallel.
It's one of the many mistakes the media make in reporting this. That's not the name of the law.
What is it called?
It's called the Law for Fighting the Coronavirus.
I stand corrected. But what are those emergency powers being used for? And could the things that have been done anyway?
Well, if you look at the different measures that have been taken, it's pretty much what other countries are doing. I would say, if you look at this law in detail, mostly it focuses on fighting the virus. It does have two components that can be construed and have been construed as being political in nature, which is the lack of a sunset clause. When will it end? And something regarding spreading false facts or true facts, but in a distorted way, in a manner that might hinder the fight against the epidemic or might lead to more infections or even more deaths. So these two things are what we are discussing about. It does not have a sunset clause, but that does not mean it's not limited in time, as Hungarian politicians, government politicians have pointed out. But even Budapest's mayor, Gergely Karácsony, does not believe that this is a timeless, a limitless decree. He does not believe that Hungary has become a full-fledged autocracy, as Gerald claims. So this is a figurehead of the opposition parties. Maybe we should give him some credit. Also, the EU Commissioner for Values and Democracy, Vera Jourova, has gone on the record as saying there's nothing in the emergency law that contradicts EU rules and regulations. Now, she is the Commissioner for Values and Democracy. EU rules and regulations do not allow for a full-fledged autocracy. So if she says there's nothing to see here in that sense, maybe we're not seeing a fully fledged autocracy after all.
But I just want to come back to that question of whether you need the Prime Minister to have the rule of the power to rule by decree. Most other governments around the world and certainly within Europe have introduced.
Well, obviously you do, and all other European countries have done this. Italy has a 6-month state of emergency. The UK has a 6-month state of emergency. Germany doesn't need it anyway. But normally, to get a law through in Parliament, it takes 6 weeks. You need to react very quickly now to lessen taxes for sorry, something fell down here. To lessen taxes for hard-hit companies, to help people to do what you need to do very quickly in terms of healthcare. So obviously, you need to shorten reaction time, and for that, you do need to be quicker. So you need this emergency procedure.
So
what you don't need is
other countries do the same. I'm just slightly perplexed as why Hungary seems to be the only one that's taken such drastic measures.
But there's no difference. The only difference is that there's no time limit. That's the only difference. But the time limit is there in an indirect way. And actually, I've issued a challenge on Twitter, and maybe Gerald Knaus and Nick Thorpe want to take me up on it. I'm betting a good can of Hungarian beer that the state of emergency in Hungary will be over by the time the state of emergency in the UK will be over. That is to say, well, whenever that will be, maybe in 6 months' time. And by that time, if that happens, I ideally hope that everyone who has been talking about an unlimited state of emergency in Hungary will then turn around and say how very sorry they are to have said such nonsense.
Nick, is that fair to say that these measures are really no different than anywhere else in Europe?
It depends what one calls emergency, of course. It's a rather rubbery word, and one emergency tends to lead to another. So obviously there's a state of health emergency. I fully agree with Boris that action needed to be taken very quickly, and Hungary actually could be praised, and I hope has been praised for issuing the state of danger so early, already on March the 11th here, when there were very few cases. But one emergency leads to another. What about an economic emergency? Is that also an emergency? Because after all, the collapse of the economy will also be an emergency. And therefore, even if the British economy is already on its feet, and I'd hesitate to take a can of beer from you, Boris, but if an emergency continues, an economic emergency following the health emergency, which we clearly have at the moment, how long will the government actually want to maintain these rules? Also, I would disagree with Boris there in terms of the actual content of these regulations, because one part of the content is to suspend the possibility of local or national referenda or by-elections. The Hungarian government depends for its enormous power on the 2/3 majority, which it only has thanks to 1 or 2 seats in parliament. It needs that state of emergency. It needs to maintain that 2/3 majority in order at the end of this year to elect new president of the Supreme Court, which would help it to further erode the independence of the judiciary, arguably the last part or what the strongest of the checks and balances left. And so I think emergencies can go on pretty much as long as the government now wants them to. The Parliament, and Boris is completely right, the Parliament could withdraw at any moment its authorization to extend it, but effectively there is no power left in the Hungarian land which could end the state of emergency except the government.
I'd love to take some questions, so please everyone do write down some questions in that little box at the bottom of the screen, and in a moment we'll come to Magdalena Williams. Gerald, you're still there, aren't you? Yeah, I can see a black screen at the moment, but I've got a question here from one person, which you can address in passing as well. Does Hungary actually want to remain within the EU? I mean, can you sort of categorize give us some background on the sort of the testy relationship between the two?
Well, if we look at not what Viktor Orban's critics say, but what he has been saying in the last years, then it's been a very consistent picture. He says that there is an existential threat to Hungary, which he's explicitly said is now coming from the West. It's Brussels and its Western countries that are trying to destroy nation states because they have a conspiracy of bringing in large numbers of Muslims, migrants, and they want to destroy nation states by settling an unlimited number, which they can manipulate more easily. And behind all of this stands the shadowy figure of George Soros. Now, this is such a crazy theory that you really find it hard to believe that for years now, it's been absolutely central to the communication of the Hungarian government. And it's been linked to extremely aggressive warnings against anyone who is part of this completely invented conspiracy. Of course, nobody in Brussels is thinking how to destroy nation states. And to present, and there I was with Boris at the time, a very unfortunate idea of distributing 160,000 refugees around Europe. To present this as 2 years later, after this was already over, a plan to destroy nation states is obviously crazy. But behind this, and this is the rhetoric of the far right around Europe, this is what Le Pen has been saying, and the AfD in Germany is saying, behind this is a sense that those who are in opposition, including in Hungary, are not legitimate opposition. They are tools of this conspirator. I mean, Orban has said this many times. They are paid by Soros to destroy Hungary, and Brussels is in on this. Now, the strange thing is that logic of this is that the EU keeps funding Hungary like no other country with massive transfers that are comparable to the transfers the US made in the Marshall Plan to its former allies, to France. Year after year, the EU is funding this, while we have a leader that is aggressively attacking the EU, delegitimizing liberal democracy, which relies on a credible opposition that might have different opinions, but that is not vilified as part of a conspiracy to destroy the nation. So if you ask me what the vision of Viktor Orban is, it's get as much out of the EU as possible, but hedge your bets. Work with China, work with autocrats, because perhaps the EU will stop to exist, and the way he is now behaving and the way Poland is behaving, the idea that the EU is heading for an existential crisis is very plausible.
We've got some questions coming in now. Isabel, are you able to open Magdalena Williams's microphone? Yes, I think we've got Magdalena there. Magdalena, can you hear me? Yeah, Magdalena, can you hear me? I don't know if Magdalena can. So maybe I'll put her question for her. Magdalena, I'll try one more time. I don't think we can. We can hear her. So Magdalena is a refugee from 56. And this is for Nick, I think, and she says she's been watching developments with frustration. Does the fact that the mayor of Budapest has agreed with other V4, that's the Visegrad 4 capitals mayors, to oppose the governments have any impact, Nick?
I think what we're seeing in Hungary since last October, when Gergely Karácsony became mayor of Budapest, and 10 other cities, larger towns across Hungary were won by the opposition, even though on the broader scale, this didn't have a big impact on the 2/3 majority, of course, which Fidesz continues to enjoy, on the widespread support and popularity Viktor Orban enjoys, especially in smaller places across the country. But what we're seeing is that Mr. Karácsony has emerged as an alternative center of power, albeit a rather humble one. To give you one practical example from the current emergency, the current pandemic, the government, one of the approaches taken by the Hungarian government and the operational group which runs its everyday practices has been to really push aside the WHO recommendation. Not alone in Europe, other countries are having trouble with that recommendation, but to test as many people as possible. In Budapest, Mr. Karácsony has now already ordered the testing of, I think, 11,000, and for next week, another 20,000 people. So in a way, Mr. Karácsony in this pandemic has become Mr. Test. And this is an alternative policy approach, which is at least being reported in the non-government media. So, and in terms of him, there are very few possibilities open to the opposition in the current situation, which is so dominated by the Fidesz government. But one of the ways, Mr. Karácsony, to refer, Magdalena, to your point, his collaboration with other mayors, because obviously capital cities across Eastern Europe and Central Europe often are, like his, in the hands of the opposition. So it gives him a little bit bigger platform. So all the time, effectively, since he won Budapest last October, he's trying to, in a way, create that platform, create possibilities in this very limited situation where his voice, to try and amplify his own voice and make his capital a little bit louder in this great debate going on in Europe today.
Paul Jackson, we can hear you. You've got a question there. I think that's probably for this question coming up is probably for Gerald. Paul, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, well done. This is all very interesting. The obvious question is what's happening about the next budget? You know, the 2021 is there going to be another bonanza for Hungary in the restructuring fund, or are the European Council cutting back the money to them?
Gerald.
Well, that's very interesting, and that of course is the key question now, because the decisions in 2013 have been taken. But the big debate now is the future of European solidarity. Leaders like President Macron have said, it's been one of his central arguments, that unless Europe helps countries that are hard hit by the crisis, economically as well as socially, populists will come to power. And he's been referring to the threat in Italy and elsewhere. The danger, of course, is that the experience of the last few years shows us that the governments that receive the most money, their rhetoric and their actions turn out to be the most against the system that was created based on the treaties of liberal democracies cooperating on the rule of law, Poland and Hungary. So more money has not bought the political support with this European project. So the question is, what kind of solidarity do we have going forward? And here I'm a bit worried about the debate in the last few weeks. I mean, you've been probably following this. The debate is very much a macroeconomic one. It's, we need to mobilize large numbers, large amounts of funds. And then the big debate is whether you do it through special bonds and who issues those bonds. And there's been much less debate on how additional money, and there have, of course, been millions, hundreds of millions already mobilized in the context of recent council meetings, how this money would strengthen a political vision. And I'm not talking about party politics or left or right, a vision of the EU as this core space of the rule of law. This is what we have been trying to do with our papers last week. It was widely picked up. I just wrote an essay on this in Der Spiegel, which will come out tonight or tomorrow in Germany, that we need a debate not just on more solidarity, but what kind of solidarity. And the interesting thing is the analogy to the Marshall Plan, which actually was a lot of money, but no more money than the structural funds the EU is spending. But it had a clear political vision.
Pick you up on that. I mean, you're suggesting a mechanism that almost goes outside of the European Union, that's independent of the European Union, aren't you?
No, I think the best thing would be if the European Union adopts rules for the spending going forward that would pick up what the Commission has already proposed, a mechanism that if there are serious rule of law problems, if there is an Article 7 procedure opened, which is for serious breaches of values, and if in this case the Commission proposed that you need a clear majority of states who say there is no breach of values, otherwise the Commission then can take action. That's one way to do it. Or what we proposed, which would have seemed absolutely unnecessary a few years ago, but now isn't, that if a country doesn't implement European court rulings related to the rule of law, the core values of the treaty. So we're talking when the court says the core values of the treaty, and it refers to them, are at risk unless something changes. If a country doesn't implement this, it should be a no-brainer that there should be consequences. Now, ideally, this is done within the EU framework, but I think countries should be ready to say, we will not be blackmailed, because the EU budget, the 7-year budget, needs to be approved by unanimity. If countries insist that there are no such conditions, then we might be prepared to set up a fund outside. You know, even the credible threat would make this debate different. I'm not against cohesion funding for Hungary or Poland. On the contrary, this is one way in which the EU holds itself together, but it needs to strengthen. And one way in which it needs to strengthen cohesion is there needs to be also communication. When the Marshall Plan was implemented, people knew about it. You know, in Italy, in the countryside, there were trucks going around with projectors, movies, to talk about what America was doing and why. There were values. It was about to create the West. Because there was an awareness that there were enemies of this idea outside of Western Europe and inside of Western Europe. You know, communist parties in Hungary and France were opposed to the Marshall Plan. Now, the structural funds, it's like a silent cash machine. Money just goes, and if you listen to the Hungarian government and its media, you get the impression that the EU does nothing. This is counterproductive. And this too, we need to raise this so in the next budgets, this is addressed.
So, Boris, can you respond to that? And then, Isabel, while you're listening, I think we've got a couple of good questions coming up from Bruce or Roma Hooper, and then Jane Sufyan as well, if we can line up their microphones in a second. But Boris, just to respond to what Gerald was saying there.
Well, first let me pick up what Nick said. He mentioned Gergely Karácsony, the mayor of Budapest. I'm happy he did that, because the very fact that he got elected as mayor of Budapest, and the very fact that indeed he does influence politics, is proof that Hungary is not an autocracy, but a democracy. Otherwise, this could not be the case. What Gerald doesn't say is that cohesion policy was based on the premise that the weaker economies in the EU should be given a boost in order to create an even playing field, economically speaking, catch up to the more developed economies, or else their more competitive companies would hold an advantage over the others. So it's just macroeconomic basics. And what Gerald is proposing, in fact, I'm not quite sure I understand the philosophy behind some of what he said. If you take money to combat the coronavirus and you make that dependent on somewhat nebulous concepts like the rule of law, who gets to define what it is, then in fact you're saying, okay, if you do not accept these political aspects, then more people will die in your country. I think if the EU does, it leaves the moral high ground. If you don't do that and you just want to attach strings to cohesion funding for the next budget, next European budget, then you should say that we are now parting with what we have been doing so far. We're not giving to the poor anymore. We're leaving the concept of the rich paying in and the poor getting money, but we will be able to punish countries which, in fact, what we're talking about is some of the poorer countries in the EU, and we'll be shifting these funds to people like Italy, hard-hit countries like Italy, Spain, etc., which are richer. And in fact, there's a case to be made that this kind of thinking will benefit mainly struggling Eurozone countries, which, as we know, don't grow as dynamically as those who do not have the euro.
But surely, Boris, if you're breaking the fundamental tenets of democracy, shouldn't there be some?
But who gets to decide on that, right? Gerald has pointed out that Poland is not respecting rulings of the European Court of Justice, and that indeed is a line that should not be crossed. Hungary has not done that yet, but somewhat deviously, Gerald talks about Poland and then somehow slides over to Hungary and says, and Poland and Hungary, but Hungary is not doing that. He's not doing that. So just to point that out, okay? I accept your point as valid, Gerald, that this is a line that should not be crossed, but Hungary has not crossed it.
Bruce or Roma, is your microphone working?
I'm trying to unmute.
Very good. Go on, far away, Bruce.
I just, in the FT article, I mean, first of all, fantastic talk from all of you. The elections, which I don't think have been mentioned, are in 2022. And the FT article is saying that Orban is attacking the opposition party leaders of towns and redirecting funds from them. This is obviously a lot more serious than what's happening in America, where obviously Trump is attacking the Democrat states. But is that something that's actually happened? Because it goes into quite some depth about taking funds from the opposition and from these towns and redirecting them.
Nick Thorpe.
Yes, that is the case. One of the first moves of the government under these powers has been to halve the amount of money available to opposition parties, and also to strip all councils, local councils, regardless, of course, of any kind of political consideration, of some of their funds in order to pool money more efficiently to fighting the coronavirus epidemic. Of course, at a time when you already control politically so much of the country, and yet where the opposition in last October's local elections, to the surprise of many people, I think, including the surprise of some of the opposition parties, actually started to make headway for the first time in 10 years of Orban's rule. Obviously, at a time like that, to say you're taking away money for campaigning from the opposition with only 2 years to go to an election in order to fight the virus, it's a very clever and a very typical political move of Viktor Orban, and one of the reasons why he puts people's shackles up so much, that he appears to be using this crisis, this genuine health emergency, for political ends, and that will weaken the opposition parties ahead of 2022. I did ask specifically different legal experts whether Mr. Orban could, under the emergency powers, cancel that election. You know, because these are almost unlimited powers. In fact, he could not. So the holding of the 2022 election will take place. There's nothing he can do to actually prevent that if he wanted to.
Jane Sufjan, are you there? Is your microphone working? Jane, no, I'll ask.
Can I just point out, Nicholas, can I just point out that while Nick was right in everything that he said, one detail was not entirely correct. The government did not cut financing for opposition parties. It cut party financing by half, and that includes the governing party.
That fair, Nick?
I accept the correction. You're right, Boris. He cut funding for all parties, but of course at a time when, it obviously affects the opposition much more seriously because
Agreed.
they don't have 476 media and they don't have the access to the public, which the governing parties do have.
Yes.
I'll try Jane once more. I don't know if Jane, you can hear us. I'm not too sure you can. I think I'll ask Jane's question for us. So this question from Jane Suthian. In as much as the media is not formally part of the state, are there any steps the EU can take to safeguard what remains of press freedom in Hungary? I think, Gerald, can you just sort of sum up some of the ways that the press freedom has been restricted in Hungary? Is that, I mean, there's been quite a lot of criticism about the inability of the media to get advertising and to really say what it wants to without having financial repercussions. Gerald, can you talk briefly about that, and also any measures the EU can think about or was mentioned?
Well, on your first question, I would gladly ask Nick and Boris, because they are in Hungary, to just describe what Hungarian public media funded by taxes, which means by everyone, not just the 49% who voted for Orban, how they are presenting politics. I mean, I think anybody then can draw their own conclusion, and how around Hungary, away from the capital, and for people who don't follow opposition web-based media, how people are informed. That there is an obvious problem. I think not even those who argue we shouldn't punish Viktor Orban would deny. If we look at the reality of what Boris has been saying, he said that rule of law is a somewhat nebulous concept. Now, that sounds like a philosophy seminar where we discuss if the terms we use can't mean whatever we want them to mean. But in politics, of course, democracy is government through discussion. We need concepts that mean something. And the rule of law, there are two procedures against two EU countries for serious violation of EU values, the Article 7 procedures against Hungary and Poland. I mean, this is a procedure by the institutions. And the fact that Viktor Orban is backing Poland to the hilt with the argument that the EU shouldn't interfere whatever happens there, gives us a clear sense of what the project is. I mean, there is a political project here.
Boris, you wouldn't deny Viktor Orban, for example, has said there's room for an illiberal democracy in Europe.
I mean, let me say one more thing on the mayor. I mean, Boris will remember, I remember, in the 1990s, Milosevic was ruling in Belgrade. There was an opposition mayor, Zoran Đinđić. That didn't mean that he had any real influence, because Milosevic did then everything to make sure that there was no real influence from the Belgrade City Hall. I mean, Viktor Orban is a very smart tactician. I mean, he is, that's why he's so dangerous. He is extremely good at choosing when he attacks whom. You don't find him attacking powerful German CDU politicians that we know he violently disagrees with publicly. You know, you will not find many attacks by him on Angela Merkel. Because he's smart, he builds alliances. He's trying to create a network of people, and he's waiting for the biggest prize, which is the return of Matteo Salvini as Prime Minister in Italy, who is a great admirer of Viktor Orban. But let's remember, Matteo Salvini a few years ago, not long ago, 2017, said that the euro is a crime against humanity, and that he feels more at home in Putin's Kremlin than in Brussels with EU institutions. These are the political friends of Viktor Orban. And what I'm saying is, in the political project of trying to keep the EU together, and it will be under enormous strain unless we find ways to make sure that the political project of Europe stands for the values in its treaty, and recognize that there are political forces, including governments, that want to see a different EU, an EU in which the kind of democracy that Fidesz or PiS in Poland envisage has its place, and you still get money transfers, you know, that this is the project. We need to wake up.
We have to stop you there. We've got just under almost 4 minutes to go, so we've got to wrap up in a second. Boris, I think you've got to respond to some of this because you know, most of the criticism has been coming from elsewhere. I've got one very brief question that anyone can answer. Paul Jackson says his question wasn't answered, which is, has the next EU budget been set? It hasn't been set yet, and those discussions are ongoing. Yeah, so, and that's a big topic, so we can't go into that in a long way. But Boris, just give a response. The criticisms overall, they do have justification. The media has been restrained. The amount of power concentrated in Orban.
Well, how has the media been restrained? To that question, Gerald answered by talking about public media, state media, and he is right. I would agree that the Hungarian government has transformed the public media into what one might call a propaganda machine. I would agree with that, probably, yeah. But at the same time, the biggest boulevard paper, the two biggest news portals, internet portals, the biggest television station, they are all vehemently critical of the government. There has been a shift of the media landscape to favor the government side of the political spectrum. It has not been achieved by rules, laws, censorship, or restrictions. It has been achieved by acquisitions. Media have been bought up by businessmen friendly to the government side. And the reason why it was possible to buy them up is a general weakness of the media. We face this problem in every European country, actually. And the culprit is us, the consumers of journalism, who are not ready to pay anymore for that product. In France, for instance, all the big newspapers are now owned by big companies who earn their money with something else. And since then, we have seen that no investigative reporting, no hard-hitting articles have come from any of these papers anymore. So this is a general problem all over the Western world due to the financial crisis of the media.
Nick, can you, we've just got 1 minute, can you just give a sort of summary of where you think things are going? You know, Orban's here clearly for a very, you know, for some time to come, and it doesn't look like the EU have got many powers to restrain him in any way.
No, that's right. He's sitting tall in the saddle, and he's a man who likes emergencies. He's a war leader in a way. He was a war leader in peacetime, and now the pandemic has given him an opportunity to be on camera every day. So in many ways, he's very skillfully using this current emergency to strengthen his powers even more effectively. He's using the pandemic as he's campaigning for the 2022 elections. Of course, for the Hungarian public who elected him, many people in the public want a strong leader, and that's what they've got at this time. And it's left the opposition pretty frustrated. But of course, the economic crisis which follows this is probably going to be much bigger, and no leader likes an economic crisis.
Very briefly, in 15 seconds, Gerald, any likelihood of measures coming out of the EU in terms of this current Corona spending that are going to sanction Hungary or Poland?
I think funding directly for Corona should not be conditioned on anything. If it's for hospitals and healthcare systems, what we are talking about is the recovery for the economies. All countries in Europe will be affected. There will be a need for recovery funding, and that money should be conditioned on clearly accepting the basic rules of the rule of law, which isn't such a vague concept. It's what the EU is based on, and there are concrete proposals, and they just need to be adopted.
Gerald, thank you very much. There we have to leave it there. I want to thank Nick Thorpe and Boris Kálnoky in Budapest, Gerald in Berlin for all their contributions. Our next webinar takes place this coming Tuesday, the 28th of April, with a special guest, Nick Bonner. It looks at art and propaganda in North Korea. Nick has been traveling to North Korea for almost 3 decades and has one of the largest collections of North Korean art. It promises to be a fascinating discussion, so do join us next Tuesday. That's at 12 p.m. BST. Thank you again, everyone, and goodbye for now.